Here we are again after quite a while. So we've finished money and interest rates. From that, you should know what money is, how banks work, at least at the first pass at how banks work, and how the central bank can control the money supply, and how that affects the interest rates, and how the interest rates affect the real economy. Now, at this stage in the class, I have two choices on which way to go. And one of the things we could do is we could put all of this stuff together in what's known as the ISLM model. But I have found out that I am teaching intermediate macroeconomics next year, so that's sad news for you. But it does mean I don't worry about that. I'm going to put that off till next year, and I'm going to do other stuff. Talk about the long run and short run in the economy. But one thing I would like to mention while we're here is that what we've done so far implies one more effect that we haven't seen before, which is called crowding out. This is how government spending can crowd out private investment. And sadly, I forgot my computer at home, and so I can't draw on things, so we won't be drawing on things. But let me just outline how it works. Remember back in the Keynesian model, when we increased government spending, what that gave us is that there was more planned aggregate expenditure. Everyone was planning the same amount of expenditure as before, but now the government was doing more. And that shifted that planned aggregate expenditure line up. To the right, at any level of interest rate. Right? See, you got to draw these things. You got to draw. If I have a piece of paper and a pencil, a piece of paper and a pencil would make everything better. I do not. Yeah. Maybe I do. Maybe I do. No, sadly, no. Maybe. Okay. Can I borrow a pen from somebody? Does anyone have a pen or pencil I can? Yes! Awesome. Okay. So much better. It'll be like a class now. Awesome. Document camera. And this, by the way, is not something that you're going to be tested on because we're not going over it in any detail, but you should be aware that it exists. Right, so we had, does this show? Yes, it does. Okay, and we'll zoom out. Do we have a zoom out? No, we don't have a zoom out. We zoom in. Oh, happy days. There, look at the graph. It's going to be awesome. It'll be great. You'll see. You'll see. And so what did we have? We had Y, and we had planned aggregate expenditure. And by this Y, we meant income or the value of stuff, right? We had our 45-degree line, which is where Y is equal to planned aggregate expenditure, which we know it must be because there's three ways to think about any sandwich. And we had C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? And that gave us the equilibrium level of Y. Right? And then we said we could use fiscal policy to get output to go up. How would we do that? Well, we would increase government spending was one of the ways. We could also do it through taxation or transfer payments. But we could increase government spending, and lo and behold, here's G. Right? So if we increase government spending, at any level of income, they're going to want to spend more than they did before. And so this whole line is just going to shift up. Shift parallel up. That doesn't look super parallel. And this is with G going up. We've increased government spending. Right? Lovely. This is great. Because, why is this great? Look, magic. Output goes up. And it goes up by more than the amount that we increase government spending because of the miracle of the multiplier. So we have gone from perhaps a recession, and we've gotten out of a recession by spending more. Okay? And in this little simple, trivial little model, our simplest model we can write, this is kind of cost-free. It doesn't hurt us in any way. Just magically, we get more output and life is good. Now, we know in our heart of hearts it can't be that simple, right? Because if it was that simple, we would just increase government spending, increase output, go up, 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 up. Magic stuff would just fall on top of our heads by spending more and more and more. And we could do this forever until we have as much stuff as we could possibly want. And why is this giving us this dumb result? Well, there's a couple of reasons why it's giving us this dumb result. It's not saying where this government spending is coming from. We're just kind of doing it. And also, we have no notion of potential output. No notion that there's like a limited amount of workforce, a limited amount of time in the day, limited amount of factories. We have no notion of that in this model. And we don't have any changing of the prices, right? We have a story where prices are preset. Somehow the firms have picked their prices, and they're just going to meet demand at those prices. And so there's a lot left out of this story, and this is clearly a silly result. It should feel silly to you. If it doesn't feel silly, think about it a little more, because it's genuinely silly. And that silliness is telling us that there is stuff left out of our model. Now, we're not shocked by that news, right? This is obviously a very simple model. Obviously, we left loads of stuff out of it, and we're going to want to be putting that in through the rest of this class and in next year in intermediate macro. But the main effects that we see here will continue on into all those other models as well. But we're going to get rid of some of the silliness. Not all. There's always going to be silliness. It's a model. It's not reality. So it's always simplifying reality. So there'll always be problems. But we can do better than this, clearly, because this is ridiculous, right? OK, but we've kind of done one thing already, which we kind of did without noticing when we did this money supply, money demand. Right, so if we have our money supply, money demand down here, we have euros down here, and we have the cost of euros, the price of euros, the nominal interest rate there. Right? We have money demand, and we said that the lower the interest rate, the lower the cost of holding your wealth in terms of euros, and therefore the more euros you're willing to hold instead of things like bonds and stocks and things that pay interest earnings. Right? Importantly, and this is just a thing to sort of think about, as we get closer to the interest rate equal to 0, if the interest rate was equal to 0, then there's a very different thing going on, right? If the interest rate is 10%, then I have a choice. I have a choice between putting my wealth into something that pays interest, that is a good store of value, or putting my wealth into something that is a good medium of exchange, but doesn't pay interest. Right? So I have this liquidity savings trade-off that I have to do, which is fine. But when we get the interest rate closer and closer to 0, if in fact if it was 0, there would be no trade-off between liquidity and store of value. Right? So those things are going to behave differently really close to 0 than they do in other places, right? When interest rates are higher. So the last 10 years, almost 15 years now, well, 13 years, ever since 2007 in Europe and North America, we've had interest rates very close to 0, so things have been behaving really weird because the store of value and the medium of exchange, there wasn't a trade-off between these two. But now the interest rates are going up, they're going to start to be a trade-off again, and this model is a little more relevant. OK, we got that. And then we've got money supply, and that gives us the interest rate. And we said that we could affect output by changing the money supply. Right? We could change the money supply, let's say increase the money supply, that would make the interest rate fall, and that would make investment go up. Right? And when investment went up, that would make output go up through the miracle of the multiplier, because investment is right here. And it would just make the whole curve shift up in exactly the same way. Now, the ISLM model just takes these two things and puts them together in a formal model. So there's nothing sort of new mechanically there. It's just how do you put it all together, which we'll do next year. But for now, we can do a little bit of the connection, and we can talk about this government spending going up. So let's go back to this government spending going up. Output would go up. We would go from a low output to a high output. Great. But now we've added something to the model to make it more realistic. We've added financial markets to the model. Okay? Very simple financial markets, just in terms of do you want to buy bonds or do you want to hold your wealth in terms of money. A very simple financial market, but it's a financial market nonetheless. Right? That's our little money supply, money demand. And we know that, okay, we saw that there's going to be a connection from here to here, right? As you lower the interest rate, investment goes up. But there's also going to be a connection between here and here. It's going to go the other way as well. Why? Because we increased government spending, that made output go up. And as output goes up, that's great. But we drew this money demand saying, let's hold everything constant, but just change the interest rate. Lots of stuff affect money demand, but we're only going to graph the interest rate because we have a two-dimensional piece of paper. And we can only pick one other thing. We got money and one other thing that we can graph. Okay? Just the feature of our graph paper, the fact that we're doing this on paper. So we picked the interest rate because that was the story we were telling. But it's probably not the most important thing. And probably one of the more important things is how much stuff are you buying? Like how much, like if there's nothing in this economy, nobody's doing anything, they don't need to buy anything, then they don't need any liquidity. But if they're buying loads of stuff, then they need lots of liquidity to do the buying because of the medium of exchange. And so now we've said that, oh, look, we're richer. Everyone's richer. More stuff is being made. That means all the companies are hiring more workers. They got to pay those workers. In order to pay those workers, they need wealth in their bank account. They need money. And so money demand is going to shift to the right. At every level of interest rate, now that we're richer, we're going to want to hold more money than we did before. Right? So this curve is going to shift to the right, and that's as y goes up. It shifts to the right. Because we're rich, we want to hold more money. Bill Gates has a bigger bank account than you and me. I'm guessing. I don't know his life, but I'm guessing he does, right? And that's because he's rich and we're not so rich. As the whole society gets richer, we're going to hold more money. That shifts money demand to the right, and lo and behold, the interest rate goes up. And as the interest rate goes up, investment will fall. So our chain of events is government spending goes up, and that causes output to go up. That causes money demand to go up. That causes the interest rate to go up. And that causes the real interest rate to go up because we said investment is a function of the real interest rate. And here we have preset prices, so prices don't change. So any change in the nominal interest rate is a change in the real interest rate. Real life, probably more complicated, clearly. Okay. Real interest rate goes up, and that causes investment to go down. And so this curve will shift partially back down. Now, how do I know it's partially and not the whole way? I can't tell you. We'd have to actually do the model. Right? It seems clear that it couldn't go more because then we'd have output back to where it was, then it wouldn't have shifted at all. But it goes partially back down. And what this means is that, yes, in this, just adding this one thing, we can still use government spending to increase output, but it's going to come at a cost. Right? So when G goes up, what do we get? We get output goes up, and we get investment goes down. Both of those things happen. Okay. I haven't proven this to you. Right? It's okay if you say, what the hell are you on about? But this is called crowding out of investment, or just crowding out. It's so classic that it's just sort of crowding out. We all know it's government spending crowds out private investment. Okay. Through the financial markets. Okay. Now what this means is that we had this little thing where we could magically increase output. Right? We could just increase government spending, output goes up, 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 up. We haven't brought in potential output yet, so we could still do this indefinitely if we're so inclined. But if we think investment, and so we defined investment to be anything that increases our productive capacity. If we increase our productive capacity, that's investment. You're going to school, that's investment. Right? Buying a stock or a bond, not investment, even though there's a future income from that. But it's anything that increases our productive capacity. Buying a factory, investment. Going to school, investment. Okay. So now we have investment has gone down, which means what we've done is we traded off output being high today, but we've lowered our productive capacity tomorrow. So we've traded off, by increasing output with government spending in this way, we've said we want our stuff now, and we're willing to accept less stuff later because we've lowered our productive capacity. Okay. Now, again, you're not responsible for this, for the exam or anything like that, because, again, I haven't really properly shown it to you. But just to give you a taste for the kind of issues that arise, and you should know about crowding out, just as a general thing. Okay. So now we're going to start our last, well, probably our last section. We may get a little more than this, but I think it's the last one that I'm going to complete for sure. Complete everything is aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and inflation. And in all of this, what we're trying to do is we're going to start trying to make this story more realistic. Right? Bringing in the financial markets was one way. It also allowed us to talk about monetary policy. But here we want to bring in potential output. We want to bring in the fact that we cannot simply make as much stuff as we want. Right? It's only so many factories, only so many people. We're only so smart. We only have so much time in the day. And it's the golden age of TV, so we can't be bothered making stuff. All of that together, right? And so we want to bring that in. And we're going to do this through this model, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and inflation. And you have seen supply and demand, right? You know this supply and demand, there's a line going up, there's a line going down, and there's a magic point where they cross. It's going to be exactly that kind of model. We're just going to put aggregate in front of it. And one of the troubles people can have with this is that we're just sort of putting aggregate in front of it. And so, whoopee, yay, I feel accomplished. I've done something with my life. I've put aggregate in front of the words that we used before. Awesome, I'm such a job. Okay, but it makes it feel like you already know it, which you kind of do, but it's a bit different. And so the stories we tell in microeconomics cannot be the stories that we tell here. So it is important to be a little bit careful with what we're doing. And also, we're going to have a long run and a short run. Right? Our story so far has been all in the short run. That is, we're meeting demand at preset prices. We got this little coffee machine that grinds the whenever anyone pushes the button. And so things are made on demand. The prices are fixed. We're not changing the prices. All the way through, we've had that silly little assumption. Right? We want to change that now. We want to say, no, firms actually have some control over prices. They have some... prices change over time. It's not that we just have the same prices. If everybody's lined up in front of this shop and they're pushing the button as fast as they can, pretty soon the shop is going to raise its prices. Right? This is how shops work. We've seen this. Right? This is the thing. And so we want to deal with that price change sort of thing, and the fact that we only got the one coffee machine and there's only so much coffee that we can make. We have a potential output. We have a maximum productive capacity. We want to bring that into the story as well. Okay? So we're going to have a long run, we're going to have a short run, and we're going to have productive capacity, and we're going to try to be careful about this aggregate versus not so aggregate and what this means for how we're supposed to think about the model. Okay. So when we want to derive the aggregate demand curve, we want to derive the short run aggregate supply curve. Short run. It's not just aggregate supply, it's short run aggregate supply. So we're qualifying it even more. And we're going to talk about the long run aggregate supply, and equilibrium and where inflation comes from. Right? This is where we're going in the chapter. Okay. So we're going to start out with aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is going to be exactly the same planned aggregate expenditure you've seen since the beginning. It's C plus I plus G plus net exports. Right? So in our first model, that Keynesian model, we said, let's take this C plus I plus G plus net exports and see how it varies as our income changes, as rich people want to buy more than poor people. That was the Keynesian cross diagram. Right? And then here, we're going to be looking at that in terms of inflation. It's C plus I plus G plus net exports. But instead of graphing it in terms of how rich we are, we're going to graph it in terms of how much the inflation is. Right? And inflation is the percentage change in prices. We have these aggregate prices, and we're going to pretend like all prices move together here. That's a simplifying assumption. And we can kind of think of inflation as kind of like prices in a regular demand curve. So you've got the demand for shoes. Let's do something simpler. Demand for buses. Right? How many times do you take the bus? How many bus tickets do you buy? Well, if the price is really high, you tend to walk more. And if the price is really, really low, you tend to take the bus more often because it's easy, it's cheap to do. Right? And so we get our demand for buses is downward sloping. The lower the price, the more you want to buy. And this is going to look very similar. It's going to be a downward sloping thing. Line down, line up, magic point where they cross. This is economics. Now we need to understand why we can think of inflation in this way, why it plays not quite the same role, but a similar sort of role, and graphically very similar. So here's our aggregate demand curve. We're going to want to draw it this way. We're going to have inflation here. It's kind of like prices for buses. We have output. Well, this is actually our purchases, right? This is planned aggregate expenditure. It's Y, but here we're thinking about it as how much stuff do we buy? 3 ways we can think of it. By the way, just as an aside and apropos of nothing, I did the whole Barbie thing. Very proud of myself with the whole Barbie thing. And then my friend said, oh, that's not how Barbie works at all. I don't know. I never played with Barbie at all. But you'll note the memes these days, right? Barbie is everything. Ken is just Ken. Yeah, see? Barbie is everything. Okay. Okay. So we're thinking about the expenditure part of Barbie. This is how much stuff is getting spent, right? This is how we're thinking about output here, right? 3 ways to think about it. We're thinking about it as how much we spend. So we're going to think that as inflation changes, we are going to spend more or less. If inflation is high, we're going to spend less. If inflation is low, we're going to spend more. Okay? Yeah, tattoo that on your arm, you're good to go. Except why? Why, Ivan? What the hell? You can't just say that. So we have to say why, right? Clearly, now we can do that, but why? So they give a bunch of things in the book, reasons why this is the case. Read everywhere. The book goes on and on about the central bank reaction function. Please, God, just tear that out of the book. The author's an idiot. You should never trust him on anything, obviously. Don't try to learn it that way. It's not wrong. It is fine. And it is the way that central bankers these days tend to think about it. But it is a terrible way to learn the material. So Ben Bernanke, quite famously a central banker, co-author on the book, he's like, we're going to do it the way that the central bankers think about it. Because he's so many years after learning the stuff, he doesn't have to worry about it. But as somebody learning the stuff for the first time, I find it extremely unhelpful. And it's because, why is it unhelpful? You can read it if you like, but I'm not going to test it. I don't want you to read it. I want you to cut it out of the book. So don't look at the reaction function stuff. They go on and on. Don't look at it. If you want, look at it. But the reason it's unhelpful is it says that this aggregate demand, one story for why this aggregate demand is the way it is that as inflation changes, the central bank changes its behavior, which is true. It is a thing. But we are going to use this model in part to say, what if the central bank wants to do something different? And then it's all muddled together, because if the aggregate demand is going this way because of what the central bank is doing, and then we want them to do something else, it's very easy to get turned around. And it's fine for Ben, because he has a staff to work this stuff out for us. But you don't have a staff, and you're learning it for the first time. It is much easier to do other stories. And honest to God, I think they're better stories. Okay? Just saying. Okay? Central banks behave this way these days. They don't necessarily always behave this way. Right? Central banks go through fads. They honestly do. This central bank reaction function has only been around 20 years or so. Who knows in 20 years what it's going to be? We want to think about it in a way that we can analyze central bank behavior rather than assume central bank behavior to get our model. Okay? So please ignore this. But I still need to tell you why the aggregate demand is downward sloping. So I'm going to give you some other reasons. Better reasons, honestly better reasons. Okay. And I'm going to give you a bunch of them. And any one of these reasons is enough reason for aggregate demand to be downward sloping in this way. That is, lower inflation means we buy more stuff. And I'm going to give you a bunch of them. But you can and should think for yourself, how do people behave when inflation is high versus low? Now, you haven't, most of you, lived through an experience with high inflation and low inflation to compare. Some of you have, but most of you haven't. Nevertheless, we are economists here. We are supposed to use our imagination. It's a fanciful field where we just make stuff up. And you should be thinking about what it would be like to live in high inflation and how do these things affect human behavior. Because what we're getting in the aggregate demand curve is human behavior when there's high inflation versus human behavior when there's low inflation. And we don't try to sketch out all of human behavior, but we do want to know how much do people buy. Right? How much do they buy that part of human behavior when inflation is high versus inflation is low. So I'm going to give you a bunch of stories. You can and should come up with more if you can. That would be lovely. I'd love to hear about them. If you do, I will put them on the list next year if you come up with any good ones. And they can go in the opposite direction, right? It's not true that just because I say it's true doesn't make it so. You can think about how people actually behave. Okay, some reasons why we might have this kind of slope for aggregate demand. With higher inflation, the real value of money decreases, leading to lower household spending. Right? So our story here is that money is the stuff that makes purchases easy. Right? It solves us from this barter situation where I need to find someone who wants an economics lecture so that I can eat. Okay? All I need to do is someone who has an economics lecture, and then I can find someone to sell me food as a totally separate issue. I don't have to do a swap in terms of food. So that's nice. And so money is the stuff that makes transactions easier. And really it's not money itself, but it's the real value of money, like how much I can buy with the liquidity I've got. Right? And if inflation goes up, I got the same amount of money, but it buys less stuff, which means I have less real spending power in terms of liquidity, which means it's going to be more awkward to buy stuff. I'll still have the wealth, but money is the stuff that makes it easy to do purchases. Now that I have less real value of money, it's not going to be so easy. And so I will buy less stuff, just because of the awkwardness of the whole thing. Okay? I might have to go to the bank more often, these sorts of things. Okay? Totally separate story, totally separate. You can buy that one or not. Totally separate story, which will give us the same result. Inflation tends to redistribute wealth from poor people to richer people. Poor people spend a larger portion of their income, so inflation would decrease spending. Now, it is not true that inflation only hurts poor people. Okay? Some people are going to win with inflation, some people are going to lose. Some rich people are going to lose badly. Some poor people are going to lose badly. But overall, the argument here is that poor people, on average, do worse with inflation than rich people. Right? So who does badly when there's high inflation? Well, people on a fixed income clearly do badly. Right? If you're on a pension and it says you're going to get 1,000 euros per month, and then there's high inflation, that's going to have less and less spending power over time. So anyone on a fixed income clearly going to do poorly under inflation. Right? We say all prices are going up together in inflation, but really they tend to be staggered. And so you have to spend more of your time doing shopping to find out which prices have gone up more today versus less today. You have to spend more of your time renegotiating your wages. Rich guys don't. And most importantly, if you have 100 million euros, you have a team of investment advisors. And they say, there's inflation, let's investigate that. And they figure out the best thing to do with your wealth to avoid getting hurt by inflation. Right? But if you're poor, you are your own investment advisor, and you're also your own dishwasher. And those two roles are getting in the way of each other, and you still want clean dishes even with inflation, and you're not going to be able to study the markets as well, and so you're more likely to get hurt by inflation than somebody who has the investment advisors. And plus, there's things that very rich people can do to avoid being hurt by inflation that very poor people can't. You buy options and who knows what. God knows. Put your money in Panama. I don't know. Well, whatever those wankers do, you can do that as a rich person. There's stuff that poor people just cannot do because their assets aren't large enough to make it happen, right? And so poor people tend to be hurt worse than rich people. Not always, but often. And if your income goes down by, say, 50 euros and you're just living hand to mouth, your spending goes down by 50 euros. But if you're really rich, Bill Gates, as his income goes down by 50 euros, he doesn't change his spending at all because, well, it's it to him, right? And so it's going to have a bigger effect on the spending of poor people than rich people. So if we make some people a little richer, some people a little poorer, redistributing wealth, that's going to reduce spending. Okay? Another reason why high inflation tends to be associated with lower spending. Okay? You don't have to buy that one either. Here's another. Higher inflation tends to be more variable, so there's more uncertainty. And because of uncertainty, we want to have more savings to deal with the uncertainty. And so if you look at countries that have, say, 2% inflation, some years it's 2%, some years it's 2.1, some years it's 1.8. Oh my God, what's going to happen to us all? And it varies a little bit. Like you can't predict next year's inflation for sure, but it's going to be 2%, give or take 0.5%. If you have a country with 100% inflation, some years it's 70%, some years it's 150%. It varies by huge amounts. And this is just an empirical fact. There's some research on why this might be, but it's not fully understood. It has a lot to do with what people's expectations are. They spend a lot more time worrying about inflation, and so sort of people can their mispredictions about inflation have bigger effects on the market. Again, that's a story for next year or financial markets in general. But this is an empirical fact. Inflation tends to be very variable when it's high and quite stable when it's low, which means if you're in a low inflation environment and you negotiate a wage and you're getting, say, a 10% increase in your wage, good for you. Good negotiating. Awesome. Then you pretty much know what your spending power is going to be over the next year because you can predict what inflation is. You'll be off a bit, but you won't be off by huge amounts. But if you're in a country with 100% inflation, where I did live for a while, and you think, okay, I get a 100% wage increase, so my real income should stay the same. But inflation might be 100%, it might be 150%, right? In which case, a third of my salary in real spending power has been wiped out. That's bad. No, I could go the other way. It could be 70% and I feel rich. And in fact, when we did live in Turkey, some years we felt super rich and some years we felt super poor because the high variable inflation meant it was very hard to predict. And this is generally true. And so if you live in a high inflation environment, you will be uncertain about your real spending power next year. Okay? And because of this uncertainty, you're going to have to take precautions to make sure that you're not destitute next year, which means you're going to have to spend less this year. Right? So high inflation, you're scared of the variability, and so you cut back on your spending. And so high inflation leads to lower spending in aggregate. Again, same conclusion, another way to tell the different story, same effect. Right? If exchange rates don't adjust, our goods become expensive for foreigners, and so they don't buy them. So in practice, in principle, if we said we had high inflation, let's say we had 10% inflation, ridiculously high levels, 10% inflation, like what we more or less got today, we would expect, we wouldn't expect, but under this theory, all the prices would go together, and so that would be the price for workers, the price for food, the price for dollars, which is just the exchange rate. The price of everything would go up by 10%. And in principle, that's fine. And if the price of everything went up by 10%, including the price of dollars, then foreigners would find it just as expensive to buy Irish goods as they did before, in real terms. They have the same number of dollars, would buy more euros, but it costs more euros to buy the stuff. It would just balance out. Okay? And in principle, that could be the case. In practice, it just is not. Like, exchange rates are one of the things that are most resistant to the analysis of economists. advertising in micro, exchange rates in macro, these things we do not understand. Okay? We work at it, we've got some understanding, but we have a terrible time predicting exchange rates. Like terrible, or explaining it ex post or anything. Exchange rates are not something that we have a good grip on. Okay? They don't seem to follow, at least in the short to medium run, any of the laws of economics. Okay? That is, if you want to predict next year's exchange rate, good luck to you, man. We cannot. Maybe you can, and you'll get the Nobel Prize and Rich both, and lovely. Please invite me to your parties. But nobody so far has been really able to. Little niches here and there. And the basic problem is, when you think about basic economics, we're talking about supply and demand. How many dollars do you want to buy? How many euros do the Americans want to buy? Well, I want to go to Disney World. Okay, I'm going to buy some dollars. They want to come to Meath to annoy their great-great-grandmother's kid. And so there's reasons for us to exchange our stuff, right? I give them some euros, they give me some dollars, and we do the swap. Right? And it's about how much stuff do we want to buy. And all of this happens, and all of this is real, and all of this is true, and we can analyze it, and it's great. But it's a tiny drop in the bucket of the total exchange rate market. The vast majority of the exchange rate market, the market for dollars, the market for euros, is speculation. Like the vast, vast, vast majority. And so then it's, do I think the price is going up? Do I think the price is going down? And how much people want to go to Disney World has nothing to do with that. It's just, do I think you're going to be buying tomorrow? And do you think I'm going to be buying the day after? And so we get all these kind of expectations-driven prices go way up, prices go way down. And we really have a very hard time predicting exchange rates. Okay? Which means that when we have inflation, there's no reason in practice, in principle, we would think that the exchange rate would go up. Right? But, price of everything else went up by 10%, the price of dollars should go up by 10% too. But in practice, it's just not the case. Like, we cannot predict next year's exchange rates at all. 5 years from now, okay, we're getting a little bit. We can kind of see, okay, there's an effect of people wanting to go to Disney World. Maybe 10, 20 years out, we have a pretty marginally okay kind of prediction. But a year from now, nothing. We got nothing. Honestly, we don't. That's a whole field of study. But anyway, this is a fact. We just don't, because of the speculation. You have to understand speculators, so you have to understand what kind of state of mind cocaine puts you in. And so the whole thing is difficult, and research is expensive. You got to get grants for cocaine, and it's not happening. So we don't really know that. But what we do know is that when prices go up, when we have inflation, we're just, in practice, not going to see the exchange rate change in any predictable way, at least for a year, 2, 3, 4. Right? Which means all our prices went up by 10%. It cost the same number of dollars to buy a euro it did before. So for Americans, our stuff has become very expensive. And for us, their stuff has become very cheap. Right? Because all our stuff went up by 10%, but their stuff didn't. And so we're going to start buying American stuff, and Americans are going to stop buying our stuff. Right? And so all of a sudden, there's less Irish stuff being purchased because the exchange rates didn't adjust. And this absolutely does happen. Okay? And so there you go. That's this one. Again, high inflation tends to mean less of our stuff being bought. Aggregate demand, downward sloping. Okay? There it is. Okay? Now, you don't have to buy all those stories, but you should find one or two that resonate with you, that feel real to you in some sense, and attach yourself to them to tell this story about aggregate demand going down. Right? You should have a good idea, at least in your own head, why aggregate demand is going down. Any one of those will work, and there are probably more you can come up with. But yeah, pick one or two that you're happy with and be happy with them. All right, so that's going to be our aggregate demand. Now, of course, whenever we draw a curve, lots and lots of things affect how much we want to buy. We can only pick one of them. Here we are picking inflation. But, how rich we are, that's going to affect how much we want to buy. I kind of captured prices here, but do people like Irish goods and services? That's going to affect how much they want to buy, right? Do we like foreign goods and services? Are Ryanair flights cheap this year? And all of that, it's going to affect Irish goods and services. So lots and lots of stuff affects aggregate demand. Okay, we've seen, we've graphed it other ways, but here we are picking just inflation to graph. So lots of things will shift this curve, but when inflation changes, we're going to move along the curve. Okay. So in particular, one of the things that we want to talk about is in the interest rate, because we're going to want to talk about policy, right? We're going to want to talk about fiscal policy. We're going to want to talk about monetary policy. Okay, and so we need to know how fiscal and monetary policy affect this curve. So one thing, we could change autonomous spending. That is, we could change people become optimistic about the future. That is, autonomous consumption goes up. Or people become pessimistic, autonomous consumption goes down. Or fiscal policy, government spending goes up. What happens? Well, this curve is just C plus I plus G plus net exports. The same stuff we've always had, just graphed against inflation instead of graphed against something else. So any of those things that change are going to shift this curve. If government spending goes up, before at 0% inflation, we wanted to buy this much stuff. Now we're going to want to buy that much stuff plus more because the government's buying more. And so the curve will shift to the right. At any level of inflation, when government spending goes up, we're going to want to buy more stuff. And if government spending goes down, the curve will shift to the left. Okay? That's fiscal policy. Okay. The other thing that might happen is we might change the interest rate. Suppose we change, which way are we going to do it? Okay, here we are. Suppose we decrease the interest rate. If we decrease the interest rate, then what happens? Well, people find that investment is more attractive, right? Because they had an option. They could take their wealth and they could use it to buy productive capacity, or they could use it to buy bonds. And bonds are an investment, right? It's just loaning someone money. They could shuffle paper around to get the nominal interest rate, or they could put it into something that increases their productive capacity. And they were making this decision, right? And now the interest rate is lower, which means the paper stuff is less attractive. And so they're going to shift more of their wealth into the real stuff. This is going to increase investment, and again, C plus I plus G plus net exports. If I goes up, we just shift this thing to the right. Okay. Exactly the same. So fiscal and monetary policy are going to have the effect of shifting this curve left and right. Okay, that's aggregate demand. One last thing to say about aggregate demand is it's just demand with aggregate tacked on it. But be careful. The stories we told in microeconomics for demand, which also look the same, downward sloping, price instead of inflation, those stories will not work. Right? So we told a story in microeconomics. I like coffee, I like tea, I just like the drugs. Get my caffeine and I'm happy. But I kind of like coffee more. And so in my daily life, I'm buying coffee. And then the price of coffee goes way up. And I say, this is ridiculous. I'm going to buy tea instead, right? I substitute away from the expensive thing towards the cheaper thing. And that was our story in microeconomics about why demand was downward sloping. When the price goes up, we buy less of it because we substitute and buy something else. Okay? Perfectly nice story. You cannot use that story in macroeconomics. That story doesn't work in macro. It only works in micro. Because here we're talking the demand for everything. And so if the price goes up, I can't substitute. There's no substituting story here because it's all the goods. If I stop buying coffee and start buying tea, I'm still buying stuff. It doesn't matter for aggregate demand. Right? So that microeconomic story doesn't work. So you need to think about these other stories instead. Okay. Now we're going to have our short-run aggregate supply. And here we're going to have to talk about this short run. We're going to define this short run slightly different. It's not that different from what we had before, but we're going to be slightly different. And we're going to, okay, that's the wrong button. We're going to have our short run aggregate supply looks like this. Okay, it's going to be upward sloping. The higher the level of inflation, the more firms are going to want to produce. And this looks just like our ordinary supply. And it is not too dissimilar, but we're going to have a more in-depth story about it here. Okay. So we're obviously going to have, we got a line up, we're going to have a line down, we're going to have a magic point where they cross, and that's going to give us equilibrium output. It's going to give us equilibrium inflation rate, magic point where they cross, as always. So mechanically, it's going to look very, very much, at least at the first set of lines, it's going to look very much like supply and demand. But we're going to want to talk about the story for our short-run aggregate supply. Why do we think it's related to inflation? Right? When we had regular supply, it was related to that price of that particular good. Now we're thinking it's going to be related to the rate of inflation. Okay. And here's going to be our story. And this is kind of a subtle story, but it is sort of foundation, not only for this model, but a whole lot of models that will come next year. So it's kind of a fundamental story. And the way we're going to think about this is we're going to think about firms entering into short-term contracts. That is, they come, and I'm going to typically talk about it in terms of labor, but it's anything, any short-term contract where you're going to enter into a contract to buy inputs to your production process, and that contract is going to be enforced for a while. So one of the reasons that Ryanair became such a very, very big thing is that early on in their evolution, everyone thought that jet fuel prices were going to be stable. And so Ryanair entered into a long-term contract to buy jet fuel at a particular price. So they had like 6 or 7 years where they locked in the price of jet fuel. Okay? And that's the price they were going to pay, and they guaranteed to buy so much of it over time. And it was a whole complicated thing, but they locked in that price. And then the worldwide price of jet fuel went up, which means Ryanair was buying jet fuel at a much lower price than everyone else in the market. And so they had much lower costs for everybody else because they had entered into this short-term contract where they're buying jet fuel at a particularly low price. Okay. So this is the kind of story we're going to be telling. Okay. Another contract that you and I are more familiar with is you get a job, you go in, and at the very beginning, there's that really, really awkward, unpleasant situation where they're saying, well, what will you be willing to take to work here? And you're saying, oh, how much does the job offer? And they say, well, what do you want to work for? And that goes on for about a week or so. And everyone's staring each other down. And you try to negotiate a salary, right? And then, if you've ever had a job, you know that you do that on the first day. And then you work for that day. And the morning of the next day, you do it all over again, and you negotiate the contract for the next day, don't you? No, you don't, because that's ridiculous, right? It was a hateful, unpleasant thing the first time. You're not going to waste 6 hours of every day renegotiating the contract. So when you get a wage contract and you start working, it is either officially or implicitly implied that you're going to be working at this wage for a while, however long that is, and then we'll renegotiate that wage again sometime in the future. Now, typically, the firm wants it to be like 100,000 years in the future, and you want to be next Tuesday after they see that you actually showed up. But somewhere in the future, you're going to renegotiate this wage. And the important thing here is that we're not renegotiating this wage every day. We are on a short-term contract. We're making this input price. You're an input to the production process, just like jet fuel. And we're going to have that price fixed for a while. Okay. How long is that while? I don't know. It's up to you and your job. But we're going to say that the short run is however long that while is. No. If you think, for example, a major construction contract that might go on for 6, 7, 8 years, most of those prices are fixed at the beginning of that contract, in which case our short run is 6, 7, 8 years. If you think you're going to renegotiate people renegotiate wages every 6 months, the short run is 6 months. Right? It's loads of inputs to the production process. They're all kind of different, but our short run is going to be sort of however long that is. before we renegotiate these prices. It's either going to be explicitly written down, like the Ryanair contract, or it's going to be more implicit, like don't come to me next month and like start this whole misery again. Wait at least 6 months or a year and we'll talk about it then, right? Either implicit or explicit, but however long that is, that's going to be our short run. Okay, I will let you go. Yeah. See you on Friday.